Okay, folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host. We have our brother Rabbi back with us this time to talk to us about some very serious situation with the nuclear reaction or the building the nuclear reactor in Iran. But I wanted to go back. We have to go back a little bit in history to sort of properly put this in perspective. Rabbi, is it not true that Iraq was building a nuclear reactor back in 1981?
So in the 80s, Iraq bought most of a nuclear reactor from France, the Osirak reactor, and they began working on a nuclear weapon. Saddam was as crazy in the 80s as he was in the 90s and into the 2000s,
Right.
and he had a bloodlust for Jews and for Israel. And Israel saw it as an existential threat. So they developed what they called, the prime minister at the time was Menachem Begin, who was a hero of the Israeli independence and one of the founding fathers of the state of Israel. And he developed the Begging Doctrine, which is that any existential threat to Israel they will deal with before that threat is carried out.
And you mentioned there, that Saddam Hussein had like a bloodlust. Give me an example of that. Give my leaders an example of that, the things that Saddam actually said or the government actually said.
So much more than things he said. Things he said you can say are political statements. Generally when dictators are trying to maintain control, they'll say all sorts of things. What I find truly remarkable is that in the writings they found in his home, his personal documents in 2003, following the invasion of Iraq, American troops found his personal documents. And he says, as soon as I'm done with Iran, there will be no more Israel.
Brazen.
So this wasn't, saber rattling. Right. That he was trying to convince Israel that he was willing to fight, or he was trying to show it to his people. In his personal writings, he talked about killing every Jew in Israel, amounting to a second Holocaust.
You're right. Exactly. Right. And then now let's move forward. Then there was the nuclear reactor in Syria, 2000. And by the way, Israel went in and took the nuclear reactor out. Is that correct?
They did. And it's worth noting that there was condemnation across the board from the UN, from all the Arab countries, from countries across Europe. The New York Times, which has always had an anti-Israel tilt, bashed Israel for it. Most American papers did. America made threats. Reagan was freaking out. Every Margaret Thatcher, who was a friend of Israel, called it an outrage and unjustified. Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was our U.S. ambassador to the UN, said it was shocking. Compared it to the Soviets, who had recently invaded Afghanistan. It was remarkably across the board condemned. Mm-hmm. And that's worth noting as we go through, as we move historically throughout the various incidents, because years later, everyone changed their mind. In 2005, Bill Clinton publicly said that everyone now knows that what Israel did was right and it kept Saddam from having nukes.
Yes.
Specifically, Secretary of Defense Cheney, when American troops were in Kuwait trying to save Saddam from wiping out another country, he sent a letter to the Israeli missile commander and said, "Thank you so much for what you did in 81, because the Desert Storm couldn't have been possible if Saddam had nukes." And across the board, so again, in those writings that the American troops found in Iraq, Saddam himself said, technically they're right in their attempts to harm us. Meaning, I understand the Israelis' point of view in trying to kill us because I'm going to kill them. So across the board, 20 years later, 30 years later, everyone agrees that what Israel did was both morally just and, according to international law, permitted because it was stopping a preemptive attack.
Yes, yes. Now, let's move forward to 2007, Syria. Syria was building a nuclear reactor. Israel took it out. Why did Israel do that?
So in order to understand that, you have to understand Bashar al-Assad. So Bashar is the third son of Hafez al-Assad. He was never expected to be the leader of Syria. He was a doctor living in England. His father had an heir, Basal, who was going to be the leader after him, and there was no question. But suddenly, in '94, Basal died before his father. So Bashar al-Assad was suddenly pulled into the family business. When Bashar al-Assad in 2000 became the dictator of Syria, America had very little idea of who he was. They didn't have files on him like they did other leaders who were up-and-comers in the region. So a lot of people really had no idea who he was or what kind of leader he was going to be. But by 2007, he had very much proved who he planned to be. And he began building in total secret a nuclear reactor. Israel figured it out and brought the information to America. America verified it, but America didn't plan to do anything about it. At the time, at 2007, you have to realize they were not that far before another election. They were already heavily embroiled in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were not had any interest in getting involved. However, at the time, Prime Minister Olmert, who had various political reasons to need to do something, also realized that the Begging Doctrine dictated that he would have to get involved. So they sent planes, the remarkably quiet and in a very small event. Planes were sent, and the nuclear reactor, which was still being built, was taken out. Now, what's interesting is the international reaction here was completely different. So we're talking about a 16 or 26-year difference between 81 and 2007. Not a single Arab country besides Syria even spoke about it, didn't put out a statement. In fact, major Arab figures in the news were saying it's very odd that these countries aren't speaking out. In fact, the only country that condemned it was North Korea. And I kind of feel that if North Korea is the only guy condemning you, you might be doing well.
Right.
Now, the IAEA, which is the supposed watchdog of nuclear activity, which we've seen in Iran, works perfectly. They did say that it was inappropriate, but within a year, they'd done a study and said, no, it was completely allowed. In actually 2011, so a few years later. But President Bush said it was right. The director of the CIA, the New York Times, all the organizations and the U.S. Congress put out a bipartisan resolution that unequivocally supported Israel's right to defend itself from a nuclear attack. So this time, the reaction was totally different because no one could deny what this was. This wasn't a leader recognized that, we don't know who he is. Maybe he's an ally against the Russians. So that major change had taken place. But in this way, the entire world stood behind Israel's right to defend its citizens.
Because it was obvious that out of Syria, again, more of these anti-Semitic remarks, threats of genocide, etc. That was coming out of Syria at that time.
Correct.
Yeah. All right.
Now, it's worth noting that in 2014, okay, so 7 years later, Daesh or ISIS took over that reactor. So one can only imagine if Israel had not acted when they did, and America was unwilling to act, and there had been nukes on that location, what the world would look like today.
Yes.
ISIS has been one of the least level-headed, let's say, terrorist groups of our time. And if we had allowed nukes to fall into their hands, God only knows what would have happened.
Yes. Now that brings us up to today. Iran is, correct me if I'm wrong, building a nuclear reactor. And I thought the Obama administration was saying, well, it's for peaceful means. They're not trying to use this for military purposes. Israel was saying, no, we're not accepting that. And, where is Israel on that situation with the nuclear reactor in Iran?
So number one, I don't believe the Obama administration thought that Iran was building it for peaceful means. Besides John Kerry, everyone in the world acknowledges that what Iran was doing was building a nuclear bomb. They've said it tens of times. They've threatened the entire world. They march warheads that are meant to transfer nuclear weapons up and down their streets and parades as the spiritual and political leaders of their country stand there with banners, "Death to America."
Wow.
So I think everyone knows what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what's the best way to keep them from it? So the belief of the Obama administration was entirely, we can accept them into the Brotherhood of Nations. There's a way to bring them back online. Now, Israel's point of view was a little different. Israel's point of view is acknowledging that Iran has been involved in trying to wipe out Jews for a generation. So in Argentina, in 92 and 94, Iran blew up 2 major Jewish sites.
Wow.
2 of the worst terrorist attacks in South American history. Iran is currently the number 1 state sponsor of terror. They support Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. What's interesting is they even support terrorist groups across religious lines.
Mm.
So Iran is the number 1 sponsor of terror in the world today. And Israel's aware of that. And although many countries like the United States and countries across Europe have chastised Israel's point of view, the fact is that every one of those countries in Europe once faced an existential question. Will we do anything to prevent the death of every one of the Jews in our country?
Hmm.
And every country in Europe failed that question. America, by the grace of God and being in the New World, hasn't had to face that question. But they have had to face it with their African American population, with their native population. And they haven't always coming out smelling like roses.
Hmm.
So Israel said, when we face an existential threat, when we face every Jewish citizen in our country being wiped out, we don't have the option to back down. It's not a political decision. It's a moral decision. What is the leader of a country if not to defend the citizens of that country? That's the primary reason for a government, is to protect the citizens.
Yes.
So Iran already has soldiers on almost every border of Israel. They sponsor Hamas, which is on Israel's southern border. They sponsor Hezbollah, which is on Israel's northern border. They sponsor terror groups throughout the Jordanian border. So Iran has soldiers right now on Israel's borders. Mm. And they have been working for years with Syria, with North Korea, with other groups to build their nuclear facilities. Now, Israel, in my opinion, has practiced tremendous restraint in not yet acting. But there is a date that everything has to change. Eventually, there will be a time of no return. Once the bombs are on, bombing them becomes an entirely different moral question. So there is a red line. I know that sometimes America says red line, they don't actually mean it. But there is a red line that if it gets crossed or if it gets approached, Israel will have to act. Now, the American point of view has been for a long time that if Israel were to act in Iran, they'd be going alone. There'd be huge repercussions. But the fact is, I think if you look at 81, then 2007, you'd see the radical change in reaction from the world. And if you look from 2007 to 2021, thanks to Jared Kushner and the Abraham Accords, Israel has friends across the Arab world right now. Israel is more integrated into Europe than ever before. Israel has stronger ties to America than ever before. And I think that the idea that if Israel were to act with clear evidence, which Israel has shown the world time and time again, somehow Israel managed to steal 4 truckloads of documents from the Iranian government. If Israel were to act with evidence, I think not only would the United States back them, regardless of who is president, but I think Europe would come around. I think the UN would have a non-binding resolution, but I think many of the Arab countries would back them, if not vocally, then quietly.
Yes.
I think that the foreign policy experts in America, who have been wrong on almost every major issue for the last 40 years, are calling this one wrong too. I think that much of the world sees the threat that Iran is to the world.
And in my last question here, first of all, let me just take this quick break to say this is Book Talk with Corbin, and I'm your host, and we're with our brother Rabbi here. We've had him on before. Please go to youtube.com, put in the search engine, Book Talk with Corbin Seavers, Seavers, and view one of our other interviews with our brother here. Brother, I occasionally will read The Final Call. I think you're familiar with that newspaper.
Yes.
Yeah, newspaper put out by the Nation of Islam. And I was, this was a few years back, but, it was sort of bragging about how Louis Farrakhan, leader of the Nation of Islam, did a little bit of a tour there in Iran. Are you familiar with some of that? Or are you surprised at that connection between the Nation of Islam and Iran?
I'm not surprised. It's worth noting that the Islamic State of Iran is from the religion of Islam. The Nation of Islam is not from the religion of Islam. They're far closer to Scientology than they are to Islam. It's a cult that believes in aliens. But I'm not surprised. Birds of a feather flock together. You have David Duke, who's on the far right, supporting Ilhan Omar, who's on the far left. Anti-Semites will always get together because that's their primary belief and it's something they have in common. So I'm not surprised to see he went there. I've seen other anti-Semites who don't share any of the religious beliefs of Iran visit. And it disturbs me, but it doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. But like you say, birds of a feather flock together. So anti-Semites hang out with anti-Semites. And I think it's safe to say, I've read some things coming out of Iran, and I was in such total disbelief at their brazen anti-Semitism. I mean, they're brazen about it. I mean, they have no qualm. And maybe I misread it or don't. Maybe I misread it. But
so Iran denies the Holocaust as a matter of state policy.
Wow.
It's just a ridiculous theocracy ruled by religiously oppressive old men who not only have horrible ideas towards Jewish people, but also oppress their own people, which sadly have gotten very little support in their struggle for freedom from the Western world. But they're an oppressive regime who have hateful views towards Israel, towards the West, towards the idea of freedom. And it's when you have people like this and you give them more and more weapons, every weapon Iran has gotten their hands on has ended up in the hands of Hezbollah, Hamas, and other radical terrorist groups. It is only logical to conclude that if nuclear weapons were ever to fall into their hands, they'd be used for evil purposes.
Yes. Well, we're going to conclude our interview right there. I thought it's very important that my listeners get this perspective. Clear, simple, succinct perspective about the importance of us supporting Israel if they deem it necessary to take out that nuclear reactor. I don't know how you feel about it, Rabbi, but I'm just not too optimistic that through diplomatic means we're going to be able to stop that reactor from becoming, for being used for military purposes, if it gets to that point.
So I'm not a politician. I don't know what political things may work or may not, but I know that if this isn't taken care of politically, there are other ways that it will need to be taken care of.
There we go. I agree with that. Brother, thank you so much for your time again.